Right. I think we are ready to go. Hi, everyone. I am Tiffany Muller, the president of In Citizens United and Let America Vote. And our mission is simple. We want to get big money out of politics and protect everyone's freedom to vote so that no matter who you are or where you live, you can access the ballot box. And those missions have become more important than ever as we see a wave of voter suppression laws being passed across the country, and gerrymandered redistricting maps that are trying to shut out people's voices, and election sabotage laws that are actually trying to overturn the will of voters after they have voted. And all of this is being fueled by a flood of dark money that's going into these national special interest groups and actually helping fuel this agenda across the country. And what it's doing is it's shutting out everyday Americans and hardworking families' voices. And it's keeping our government from being responsive to them and helping tackle all of the priorities that we know they have. Everything from an economy that works for everyone, lowering prescription drug prices, addressing climate change. We have important work that we have to do. And the only way we can do all of those things is if we first shore up our democracy and make sure that we have a functioning, responsive government, one that works for the people. And that's why we know that Congress must pass the Freedom to Vote Act. And the Freedom to Vote Act, a bill that our special guest today, Senator Angus King of Maine, who's one of the lead co-sponsors of this bill, and he's been working tirelessly to pass it. The Freedom to Vote Act does four really simple things. First, it makes sure that everyone has the freedom and the right to vote, and that you don't have to run an obstacle course to get your ballot cast. Number two, it ends that partisan gerrymandering. Number three, it gets big money out of politics. And last but certainly not least, it actually protects our election officials and makes sure that the will of the voters won't be overturned by partisan officials. And last month, 50 senators voted to begin debate on that bill. But the Republicans in the Senate, led by Mitch McConnell, all filibustered that motion and wouldn't even allow debate to begin. And just yesterday, we saw them do the same thing on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And these two bills taken together are really the sword and the shield of voting rights and are what we need to make sure that we protect that fundamental freedom to vote in our country. So it's such an honor to be here today with Senator King, who has been such a leader on getting this bill passed and doing what's necessary to protect our democracy. And it's also a great honor to be here and to co-host this event with our partner in this fight, Anna Kellar, who's the executive director of the League of Women Voters of Maine and Maine Citizens for Clean Elections. So many of the standards that we're talking about that need to be set nationally are in place in Maine. And they have really been leading the efforts on showing what a fair and free system can look like. So with that, Anna, thanks for being here today, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. I'm really honored to be here with you. The League of Women Voters of Maine and Maine Citizens for Clean Elections together are nonpartisan organizations that have a combined 127-year history of working for a government truly of, by, and for the people. We stand for the right of all people to be active participants in their government. We educate voters, empower people to participate in civic life, and we advocate for policies that strengthen our democracy. Like Tiffany said, in Maine, we have a lot to be proud of when it comes to ensuring our freedom to vote. We're consistently among the highest states in voter turnout, and we've been a laboratory for democracy, passing groundbreaking reforms like clean elections and ranked choice voting. For decades, we've run secure, trusted, and high participation elections with policies like same-day voter registration, secure paper ballots, robust absentee voting, many of the same policies that the Freedom to Vote Act would bring to voters nationwide. We are still working for better, of course, even as many states have erected barriers to voting and turned back to the dark days of Jim Crow restrictions. Maine has continued to make progress. This year, we passed online voter registration, banned corporate contributions to legislators, strengthened requirements for voter information and ballot tracking, and passed an election security bill with the unanimous bipartisan support of the Maine Senate. Provisions in the Freedom to Vote Act would help Maine support our hardworking town clerks, modernize our election security infrastructure, and give an extra layer of protection for our hard-won rights to vote. Maine, we can be proud of our own state's democracy, but we can't stand alone, of course. We are Americans first, and when the voting rights of our fellow citizens are under attack, we are not free. When our democracy is shaking at its foundations and politicians spread malicious information and voters start to lose trust in their elections, we can't sit back and rest. That's why I'm so proud to be represented in the US Senate by Angus King, a leader who has a clear sense of the moment in history we occupy and the responsibility of those in the Senate especially to stand for the preservation of our democracy. As he said in his floor speech on the Freedom to Vote Act, quote, "Now is the moment to reach beyond region, beyond party, beyond self, to save and reinvigorate the sputtering flame of that idea," end quote, the idea of democracy and self-government. That's the leadership that Senator King has been providing in the Senate, especially in these difficult times. And with that, I'm so happy to turn it over to Senator Angus King.
Well, thank you so much, Anna and Tiffany. It's great to have the opportunity to join you. It's sort of hard to know where to start, but I think one of the points that needs to be made and needs to be emphasized is that the United States of America is an anomaly in world history. The norm in world history is not democracy. It's pharaohs, kings, dictators, czars, warlords. Lately, the favored term is president for life. but the norm is some kind of autocracy, some kind of authoritarianism. And the other side of that coin is that when you have that authoritarianism, the people have no voice and they're abused. That's in human nature. And history tells us, as I mentioned on the floor, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And our system was ingeniously designed to fundamentally wrest power with the people. That's why the first three words of the Constitution are "we the people." It wasn't "we the states" or "we the corporations" or "we the entities, associations." It was the people. That was a radical idea in 1787. And it's still under assault around the world. And the second thing about our system that we have to realize is it's fragile. It really is an experiment, and it's a 245-year-old experiment in an ocean of authoritarianism going back 100,000 years. And so we Americans tend to think that tomorrow will be just like yesterday, and that history is goes back to at the most 1982 or something. But the reality is what we have is very fragile, and it can be undermined. And I think Anna mentioned the key word, which is trust. And what we've had over the past 8 months, and actually it goes back more for 20 years or so, but we've had an erosion of trust in our system that is unprecedented in my lifetime. 1/3 of Americans today passionately believe that the election of 2020 was fraudulent, that Joe Biden is not the president, and that that there's widespread and rampant fraud in our elections. It's absolutely not true. There's no evidence of it, and every time they try to create evidence or find evidence, it blows up in their faces. The so-called audit in Maricopa County, Arizona, is a perfect example. That was a partisan effort to desperately find fraud and misrepresentation and miscounting of ballots in that county, and they ended up at the end of the process, they found out Joe Biden won by 300 or 400 more votes than they thought. And this was a partisan effort, and they still couldn't find the fraud. So but nonetheless, 1/3 of Americans and about 2/3 of Republicans believe that the election was stolen. What's happening as a result of this campaign of undermining of trust is that in many states, under the pretext, and it is a pretext of election integrity or protecting against fraud, laws are being passed which have the effect of disenfranchising people. And sometimes it's very subtle. Sometimes it's hard to, you'll read a change in the rules that says that in Georgia, the legislature can replace the board of supervisors in a county. And you say, well, okay, what does that mean? Well, if the result is that they put in a partisan election board that says you're going to have so many voting places in black precincts and twice as many or 3 times as many in white precincts, and you have 6-hour lines in the where there are people of color and half-hour lines, that's a restriction. That's designed to disenfranchise people. And I think it was Tiffany that mentioned that one of the things that is even more insidious is efforts of various states to take over the choice of presidential electors from the voters of the state and allow the partisan legislature to substitute their own electors. Now, where does this all lead? As I mentioned, 1/3 of Americans think we had a fraudulent election. If those measures are put in place, we're going to have 2/3 of Americans not trusting elections. Imagine if if in Pennsylvania you have a vote for one of the candidates, and then the legislature says, no, we think there was fraud, so we're going to say the other candidate gets our electoral votes. You've undermined trust in the whole system. And our system rests upon trust. It rests upon the people waking up the day after the election and saying, oh, that was great, my candidate won, or oh, I'm disappointed, I'm going to work harder next time. But when that trust erodes, which it's already starting to do, then you've undermined the entire bedrock of democracy. And that gets us to the Right to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We're not trying to federalize elections. I'm a former governor. I'm a states' rights. I don't make them. Shanna Bellows as Secretary of State, she's going to make the decisions, and the governor and the legislature in Maine. But what we're trying to do is establish a floor where, okay, you're going to have your own state administration, but we're going to have a floor of some minimum standards. So that it makes it much more difficult for a state legislature to surgically disenfranchise voters. And by the way, they'll tell you we're trying to root out fraud or whatever there is. If there's no fraud, ask yourself why they're doing it. They're doing it to suppress the vote. They're doing it to fix, and I'm using that word fix, elections in the future. And if we end up with a system where the whole structure is people lack trust in it, and it's set up in such a way that only one party wins, democracy is a memory. And the final thing I want to say is think about where that leaves us as a people, because if you can't trust elections to make these decisions, what are your options? And what worries me is on January 6th, we saw people who believed that their only option was violence. And they, I don't justify what they did, but these were people who had been told that something had been stolen from them. And they felt that they had no other recourse. They kept losing in the courts. The election recounts didn't go their way, so they resorted to violence. And the peaceful transfer of power is at the heart of our democratic idea, along with the idea that the people are in charge. So that's why I consider this bill so important, along with the John Lewis Act. And that's why we're trying to do everything we possibly can to figure out how to move it forward. And Tiffany mentioned there are a couple of things. It's not only about voting, but it's also about ending partisan gerrymandering, which I can tell you from being in Congress is one of the real problems. And it works both ways, by the way, Democratic districts, Republican districts, because you end up with members of Congress from one extreme or the other, and they don't talk to each other. They don't want to talk to each other. They don't want to compromise. And that means we can't get anything done. It also makes a huge step toward the goals of End Citizens United, which is no more dark money. have people identified who make contributions. It's preposterous that somebody in Maine that makes $100 or $200 contribution to my campaign, I have to list their name, address, their occupation. But if somebody goes out and forms a phony super PAC and calls it a social welfare organization, and they could spend $10 million against me, and we've seen this in Maine in recent elections, but we have no idea who these people are, that just undermines the people's right to information. Information is the heart of the people making decisions. They can't make good decisions without good information. And part of that information is who's trying to influence my vote. And that's why I consider the dark money piece of the Right to Vote Act one of the most important pieces. So I'll end with I'm a pretty straightforward guy. I always thought the idea was to have more people vote. Would have the highest turnout in the next election. I mean, and I never thought you would ever try to see which state could have the lowest turnout. By the way, unfortunately, Minnesota used to edge us out by 1 or 2 points, but just as Anna said, we have all the things that the opponents of voting rights say are worrisome. Same-day registration, 24-hour drop boxes, no excuse absentee voting, mail-in voting, no voter ID. And you know what else? We also have no fraud to speak of. I mean, there maybe been a half a dozen cases in 10 years, but nothing like the kind of widespread fraud that was alleged in the last election. So Maine is a good example for the rest of the country. And I say that down here to my Republican colleagues. What are you afraid of? I said, is your state more dishonest than my state? Because we don't have these problems and we have all the things that you say are dangerous. So that's where we're trying to go with this legislation. It's very tough. And as you know, the rules of the Senate now require 60 votes. The Republicans have taken basically a no negotiation position. All of us have talked to various colleagues on the Republican side saying, okay, you don't like this bill. What do you like? Make us an offer. What do you think will work here? And we're getting absolutely nowhere. The arguments I'm getting back is, well, we don't want to federalize elections, or B, there's really not a problem with these state laws. Nothing really is going on. Of course, my answer to that is, okay, then why are they doing it? But so we're at a impasse right now, but we're working very hard to try to find a way to resolve that. We're talking to Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema. I myself have been very reluctant about modifying the filibuster rule because it can come back to bite you in the future if the shoe's on the other foot. But I think when it comes to democracy itself, a Senate rule has to give way, and we're going to have to find a way to work through this. We're certainly trying very hard, and I can tell you that there are a lot of good people who are trying to find every possible way that we can resolve this issue and get these bills passed to the benefit of not only the American people, but to the idea of America itself.
Thank you so much, Senator. And I think there is no way that anyone could hear what you just laid out and not feel really concerned about the future of our democracy, the moment we are in, this inflection point that we are seeing going on across the country. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that there's a little bit of smoke and mirrors going on, right? No, don't worry at all about these state laws that are being passed. Don't pay any attention to them, but we don't want this federal law that contains these really, frankly, pretty common sense measures that states like Maine have in place already. And, sometimes when a bill is in the Senate and you have Democrats on one side voting and Republicans on the other side voting, what can get lost is the fact that actually across the country, this bill has really bipartisan support. Democrats like it, independents like it, Republicans like it, because everything in it's really common sense. And as a matter of fact, it actually is built on bipartisan origins. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that. Can you speak to the bipartisan nature and the origins of this bill?
Well, a lot of the ideas are ideas that have been around for a long time. And voting rights has traditionally not, well, it was controversial, of course, in the 1800s, but starting in 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed, since then, it's been non-controversial. It's been renewed, I think, 4 or 5 times, signed by Republican presidents, Ronald Reagan, George Bush. The last time it came up for a vote in the Congress was 2006. This was the renewal of the Voting Rights Act. I think the vote in the House was something like 360 to 33, and in the Senate it was, you ready for this? 98-0. Now, what's happened in the interim is that disenfranchisement has become a policy of one of our great political parties, and I I always thought you won elections with better candidates and better ideas, and the saying is the people should pick the politicians and not the politicians pick the voters. But that's where we are, and yeah, I'm sort of perplexed by it. I don't really understand it, except, I guess at the end, the human nature inclination is to hold on to power. And power seems to be ebbing away in terms of elections like the one in 2020. Although elections yesterday, this earlier this week, the Republicans did quite well. So maybe they'll gain a little confidence in elections. I didn't hear any fraud allegations after Tuesday, but it is. I ran across a quote today from Reinhold Niebuhr, the great theologian, and it's to me it really captures what we're talking about. And excuse me, he used the word man. He if he were writing today, he'd say people, but he said man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible. Man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. Isn't that beautiful? I mean, it's sort of like Lincoln's better angels of our nature. We all have within us the, good and bad, and we have the capacity to have this democratic system for an unusual place in history where the people actually get to make the decisions. But we also need to have democracy to protect us from the government that we're creating, because people have also dark angels, and that's something we have to be concerned about. So a lot of the ideas that are in these bills have been in nonpartisan bills in the past, and a lot of them come from the states that have passed these things. Well, for one example, I heard today, John Tester was saying in Montana, in something like 1999 or 2000, with a Republican governor and a Republican legislature, they passed same-day registration. This year, they repealed it. And so there's a case where it was a Republican initiative, and now it's a Republican initiative to repeal it, because I guess they don't like people that register late or something. But anyway, yes, you're right. This is not historically a partisan issue.
Senator, you were talking about the importance of trust in elections, and I was hoping you could say a little bit more about how you think the Freedom to Vote Act can help to restore some of that eroding trust in our elections and
there are
preserve its security. Yeah,
there are provisions in it. All the attention is on things like early voting and voter IDs, but there are provisions in it to shore up our election systems, to provide resources to the states, to require paper backup. I've done a lot of work in the last couple of years on cyber, and you should never have an election system based on the internet, number one. And number two, everything should have a paper backup so that you can have an audit trail after an election is completed. And there are those kinds of pieces in there that are designed to restore trust. But Anna, we're never going to restore trust if our leaders keep telling people that the elections are fraudulent. I mean, that's one of the real problems. I mean, no presidential candidate in American history has done what Donald Trump has done over the last 9 months, or 10 or 12 months, actually, going back now for a year. Al Gore in 2000 lost Florida. We don't even know whether he lost Florida, but it was 400 or 500 votes. That was the election. It was decided by the Supreme Court. Al Gore conceded. He could have kept fighting. He could have kept telling people it was fraudulent and railed against the Supreme Court and who appointed the judges and all that kind of thing. He didn't do it because he knew it would be harmful to the country. And if you go back to that period, that was the basis of that decision. Richard Nixon in 1960 could have questioned that very close election and decided not to contest it because of exactly what we've seen over the past 10 or 12 months, the undermining of confidence in the election. That is to me, just unforgivable because of what it has done to the public's trust in the election. If President Trump had said this was a hard-fought campaign, I don't like it, I feel I should have done better, and I'm mad as hell, and by golly, we're going to come back in 4 years and we're going to turn the Senate and all those kinds of things. But the election's been occurred, and we're going to have a peaceful transfer of power. I'll be at the inauguration of President Biden, and I congratulate him and wish him well. We wouldn't be in this place where we have a third of the country that doesn't believe in the elections. They don't believe in the elections because their leaders have told them not to. And that's something new in American history. I don't think it's ever happened before. And it's extremely dangerous. And that's why we need to start building confidence back by common sense underpinning of the democratic process. And if there are allegations of fraud, they should be investigated. And if people commit fraud, they should be prosecuted and they should pay the penalty. But to try to disenfranchise people, my point is we could end up with twice as many people not trusting the system on the other side. If these laws are passed, and if they have the result of disenfranchising tens or hundreds of thousands of people, or if a partisan legislature overturns the will of the voters in their state in the presidential election of 2024, it won't be just the Republicans who distrust elections. It'll be the Democrats and the independents who are saying this system is just hopelessly screwed up and I can't trust it. And then where are we? That's what worries me.
That worries me too, Senator. And we are so grateful for your leadership in fighting against that moment that we are in and fighting to pass the Freedom to Vote Act. And I could really stay here and talk about this all day, but it turns out that we are out of time already. So I want to thank you, Senator, for all your leadership and being here with us today. Thank you, Anna, for co-hosting this with me and for all your amazing work in Maine. And for everyone watching, join in, raise up your voice, tell your senators, tell your representatives to pass the Freedom to Vote Act. Go to actforthepeople.com, actforthepeople.com, and we will tell you how to get involved. So thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks very much. Great to be with you. Let's get the bill passed.
Let's do it. Bye, everyone.